Well, we're delighted to have all of you here. Welcome on behalf of the co-conveners of the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative, the IKEA Foundation and the Loudest Foundation, and the organizers of this event, Eco-Agriculture Partners, Climate Kick, Common Land, Regenerative Development Group, and Rainforest Alliance. This is the second in our dialogue series on landscape finance. For those of you who were not in our first dialogue, 1,000 Landscapes is a radical collaboration of change agents working all around the world to accelerate landscape efforts to sustain and restore ecosystems, build rural prosperity and food security, and confront climate change. Our focus now is on strengthening the capacities of landscape partnerships, multi-stakeholder landscape partnerships, to try to help them build coalitions to influence policy, bring the information technology revolution to meet landscape priorities, and to mobilize finance. We're co-designing and testing innovations right now with more than 22 landscapes, and we're developing a partner network to serve 1,000 landscape partnerships to scale their impacts over the next decade. As all of you know, one of the greatest challenges for landscape transformation is to mobilize financing for all the projects that need to work together to achieve that. At the same time, what we're seeing is a massive flow of financing for climate, for biodiversity, for regenerative agriculture, for water, for rural development and urban development that's having a very big problem reaching the people on the ground, reaching the individual kinds of projects and activities that are needed. We believe that integrated landscape finance provides a potentially powerful solution for both the landscape partnerships and the finance community. And a centerpiece of 1,000 Landscapes is to try to see how we can address and catalyze ways to address those. So I'm going to start here just to give you a few technical notes for our activities today. First of all, we encourage you to adjust your name so that you include your organization, so folks here know who else was in the room as we try to start a dialogue. And you can change that with the participant tab that's at the bottom of your screen under rename. Secondly, we encourage you to use the chat. And you can start by introducing yourself now, your name, your organization, any particular interest that you have on finance, and feel free to use the chat for comments, to share materials, ask questions to the speakers or whatever. The third thing, we're going to use today a slightly different technology than we used in our first dialogue. We've got the whiteboard that's associated with the Zoom, and we'll be using that in the second half of our event today for the dialogue. And our facilitator, Shannon, will explain that when the time is coming. If you have any questions or concerns about using technology or anything else, you can contact through the chat my colleague, Lily Hamilton. And you can find her in the chat function there and ask her individually questions if you need any help. And finally, we will be, you're all muted now, and we'd actually like to keep you muted, have you stay muted throughout the initial presentations. But then when we come to the moderated discussion session, we'll open that up and you'll be able to raise your hand and participate. So with that, I'd like to get started on the program itself. And introduce you to Daniel Zimmer, who's the Director of Sustainable Land Use for Climate Kick and the co-lead of the 1,000 Landscapes Finance Solutions Design Team, who's going to provide an overview of the work we're doing on landscape finance with 1,000 Landscapes and our dialogue series and introduce the one today. So with that, let me pass it over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to be here in the second dialogue this afternoon. Afternoon for me because I'm based in France. And I want to just introduce this second dialogue by reminding you of the objectives and how we have conceived and designed this dialogue series. So we know that we need to match the landscape approaches and the development of portfolios of activities with relevant instruments able or mechanism able to match these systemic approaches in landscapes. And this is difficult. So to do this, our dialogues aim to bring together the knowledge, the learnings from landscapes initiatives and of funders. And from this, understand the challenges of shifting financial flows to locally led investment strategies for landscape regeneration, and identify ways to address these challenges. So with these three objectives, we have imagined three dialogues. Next slide. The first one, starting from a landscape perspective. So we, in the first dialogue, we invited landscape partnerships to present the way they develop their portfolios of activities to transform and regenerate their landscapes, and how they mobilize finance for these portfolios. So we had quite a successful dialogue with 12 landscapes presenting PowerPoints or presentations of how they did this, and 2 of them presented during the first dialogue. It was very rich input and a lot of learnings, from which I would just simply keep 3 highlights. The first is great diversity of landscapes and a very great diversity also of funding mechanisms implemented. Second, the importance of de-risking the approaches and the role of initial grants, public funding, in order to leverage other funding, particularly from the private sector in these landscapes. And third, the time required to really start implementing these landscape programs, because of the need to build trust between stakeholders and with funders. Very often, the first step is to transform the local stakeholders from competitors to allies and agreed on a common vision. So the second dialogue today starts more with the investment and the mechanism for funding these portfolios. What type of models exist, and what mechanisms can be implemented. So we will focus on this today, and we have selected today a number of mechanisms that are specifically targeting this landscape level to support the implementation of the portfolios of activities. We will, in particular, look at the coherence of the transformation of the landscapes, and see how the instruments or the mechanism implemented can keep the coherence of the landscape transformation. And then we want also to recognize that we are still in an emerging phase for these questions. So dialogue 3 will then build on the 2 first ones and exchange on gaps and opportunities. Next slide. I'm almost through. So for today, we have collected also 10 or 9 mechanisms that are listed and presented on this slide. You will see all continents again represented, and a link to the full presentations is or will be provided to you. By the way, we are also developing a mirror board where all the information is collected and made accessible. So 2 of these landscapes, next slide, will be presenting in greater detail. So the Cascadia Foodshed financing projects and the ANEI carbon finance for forest-friendly coffee landscapes. So these 2 presentations will soon be presented to you after a generic presentation from TED, and will be followed by moderated discussions on 2 topics, which will be presented after. Thank you and enjoy the workshop.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And now let me introduce my colleague from Eco Agriculture Partners, Seth Seamus, who's our Director of Finance and Policy, and also the co-lead with Daniel of the 1000 Landscapes Finance Solutions Design Team, who's going to give us a bit of a quickie overview of the concept of integrated landscape finance mechanisms. Go ahead, Seth.
Hey, well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for your participation today. I will pick up where we left off in Dialogue 1, which focused on the development of integrated landscape investment portfolios. Today, we're going to discuss the ways that those sets of integrated projects can be financed. And to recap the ideas from the first dialogue, our jumping off point is the observation that to address these very complex ecological and social challenges requires action not only at the farm, enterprise, and supply chain level, but also at the landscape scale. Landscape we're defining as a place that requires coordinated management for the stakeholders living there to meet their interlinked objectives. And looking at finance in this context introduces new ways of thinking about how different projects and enterprises in a landscape can have powerful, positive, or negative interactions that impact profitability, risk, and social and ecological conditions. So integrated landscape finance today we'll be discussing how to fund this landscape scale transformation. So next slide. So the dimensions of landscape finance, very quickly, a review from these dimensions presented in detail in the first dialogue. We've got the vision and strategy, developing the action plan, identifying finance needs, and then moving on to developing finance mechanisms and mobilizing finance. So today we're going to focus more on the number 4 and 5 of this. Once you've identified what you want to do, how can you fund this? So next slide. What led us into this work initially was the observation that even very well-formulated landscape action plans based on well-facilitated multi-stakeholder process had trouble getting funded. In a given landscape, this requires a financing mechanism or a set of mechanisms. These mechanisms need to fund multiple activities across sectors with financial, environmental, and social synergies between the activities that are coordinated in space and time that support landscape objectives. So this is how we're defining landscape finance mechanism. What separates this approach from some sustainable land use investment efforts, some other sustainable land use investment efforts, is that it's embedded in this broader strategy at the landscape scale. So we're not talking about an investment fund that is looking around the world to find farmers who want to sequester carbon in their soil or in trees. So a fund like that could become part of a set of landscape finance mechanisms in a given landscape if it aims to connect directly to a certain set of landscapes and make us an effort to support the locally developed set of priorities in that place. So next slide. So for these mechanisms, form follows function. And so we want to lay out first the roles that need to be filled in order to fund these landscape investment portfolios. So these can be described in 3 buckets. So first you have resources for planning and project development. Then you have direct investments in projects. And so these are finance mechanisms in all of their glorious diversity, a spectrum from commercial to non-commercial, all kinds of equity, all kinds of debt with varying ticket sizes, risk appetites, levels of patience. In addition to these, there are some unique elements of landscape finance that require enabling services. So this is support for landscape partnerships to identify priorities, potentially aggregating investors, aggregating deals, deal development, and deal brokering. Next slide. So I'm now going to describe the types of mechanisms and entities that perform these roles. So you'll see these represented among the presentations and slide decks that have been prepared for this session. So keep in mind that these categories of types don't totally overlap with the roles because a single mechanism or entity can perform multiple functions. So first we have the landscape finance mechanisms themselves. And so these are entities through which funds flow directly. These include grant facilities as well as mechanisms that contain a commercial component. Following slide will cover the support services. So now we'll talk about the mechanisms. And if, by the way, if you're interested in more detail on this, you can look through this paper on landscape finance models that's included in this session materials from 2020, which lays some of the foundation for our current thinking on these issues. So, okay, first we have grant facilities. The purpose of these are to allocate grant capital to strengthen landscape scale institutions and to build the pipeline of projects that are aligned with the visions and strategies of these landscapes. So Landscape Legacy Fund and the Southern Africa Development Community Transfrontier Conservation Areas Finance Facility are great examples of these, which are included in the presentations. The rest of these mechanisms include a commercial component. So in many cases, these operate as blended finance instruments that utilize public and philanthropic resources to attract for-profit investment. And these can take a number of forms. So there are landscape-specific investment funds, and these are developed to serve the investment needs of a specific single landscape. So examples, the Agua Tica Water Fund, which is serving the watershed of San Jose, Costa Rica, is an example of this. It illustrates the water fund model, which is operational in a variety of watersheds in Latin America and more recently in Africa. And you'll be hearing in a moment from the INE experience, which is working on the finance mechanisms for its coffee landscape in the northeast of Colombia. And then there are funds that are developed to focus on multiple landscapes. So these are funds that are created with a landscape lens, but are initially untethered to a particular geography. The Landscape Resilience Fund is a very innovative example of this. It includes one window that targets small and medium-sized enterprises and another funding window that directly supports multi-stakeholder landscape institutions in the development of project pipelines to support the goals of those landscapes, where the SMEs investments are located. Landscape development finance institutions, there's an example of this that you'll hear about in the Cascadia Foodshed Finance Project, where the project worked with a community development finance institution, which is an entity which is, it's not, US isn't the only place it exists, but predominantly in the US, that directs loans to sustainable food system investments in a particular place. Then there's the idea of the landscape bond. Finally, we don't have an example of this in this set of presentations, but this is an area of great interest to our design team. And very shortly, we'll actually have a paper coming out about this. And it's also an idea that's being analyzed in one of our accelerator landscapes. Okay, next slide. So the types of the landscape finance services, these are the aggregators, the project developers, the brokers, the variety of ways that these roles are played depending on circumstances. So in some cases, the partnerships, landscape partnerships themselves take on these roles. We see this in the Great Lakes Impact Investment Platform and the Cascadia example. Both of these initiatives play the role of aggregating investors and identifying investment opportunities. When the partnerships aren't playing these roles directly, and even if they are playing some of them, there can be external service providers that support them. These could be nonprofit or for-profit entities. While there is a small cohort of NGOs and consultants that have begun to take on these roles out of necessity, there are very few groups that we know about that have specialized expertise working on finance issues in integrated landscape contexts. So another phenomenon we see coming up is accelerators and incubators, which are working to build capacities throughout the system. So this is an area that 1,000 Landscapes Finance Accelerator is working in. And this is an effort to develop tools and approaches that can be used by partnerships or external specialists to facilitate landscape finance, all while supporting individual landscapes. And for those interested, we'd be happy to talk to you more about how that works. So without further ado, let's get to the presentations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Seth. That was great overview. Now let's get into the fun, as you say, the fun part of showing how this actually plays out on the ground. So let me first introduce Tim Crosby, who is the principal at Thread Fund. And he's also a steering committee member of the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and the chair of the Transformational Investing in Food Systems Initiative, TIFS. He's also a former manager of the Cascadia Foodshed Financing Project, which he's going to present today. So go right ahead, Tim.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for that introduction. That means I don't have to do that. I'll just drop right into the presentation. The Cascadia Foodshed Financing Project, or CFFP, began as an effort by my interest to try and connect with other philanthropists and investors in my region of the Washington and Oregon corner of the US. Traction began to occur once a few foundations realized that they were funding basically the same issues in different parts of the region. We organized the above foundations that you see on the slide and a few private investors around one fundamental question: If our shared goal is to catalyze, oh, am I getting ahead of the slides? Nope. Just go back one, please. Back to the beginning slide. One more. Thank you. We organize the above foundations and a few private investors around one fundamental question. If our shared goal is to catalyze a strong, thriving regional food economy in the Pacific Northwest, in what should we invest and how? The project began after different independent projects had not achieved their objectives, so there was no clear path forward. Building on trust and relationships, a series of partners agreed to learn on the fly as we sought to deploy capital. The group asked me to coordinate the work since I knew everyone and had done similar work before, and also to stay engaged as an investor. Next slide, please. Focusing on the two U.S. Pacific Northwest states of Washington and Oregon, CFFP sought to identify products that grow well here without chemicals, identify their market drivers and the ensuing investment opportunities. The initial thesis was that by creating a shared mechanism in which different types of investors could participate, we could more directly impact positive gains in sustainable food production that is consumed within our region. Washington and Oregon are trade-dependent states, and the majority of food is exported to global markets. Washington state is number 1, 2, or 3 in the US for the production of 16 crops ranging from apples and hay to peppermint oil. Next slide, please. CFFP brought together different types of foundations and private investors. With this comes different challenges. I left this as a text-heavy slide to address a system intervention point. The key is not to try and solve independently for each one. Instead, the goal is to solve them all together, directly and indirectly, as you go by generating aligned movement towards a shared vision that addresses systemic goals like healthy food production, sustainable livelihoods, resiliency, and a growth of a circular economy. Next slide, please. Initially, the project had a very simple timeline. Create an aggregated value of investment interest, say we want to invest, see what pipeline comes in, then invest individually alongside each other. The timeline became dynamic when that did not work. So we pivoted to developing a more formal strategy that revealed the complexity of the issue. This showed the need for research. But as the research was unfolding, it was not resonating with other investors. So then we contracted with a private lender to analyze the work. This led to the emergence of a logic model gap in 2016, which I'll describe in a minute, which led to a major pivot in direction and extension of the timeline, a decision to raise grant capital instead of finance capital and engage an existing lending institution for 2 years. We felt that by working with a trusting lending institution, we could use their expertise to test true market demand. And if after 2 years they were successful, they would not need grant capital for that position any longer. If they were not successful, then we saved raising $10 to $20 million into an organized fund that we would not have been able to invest. What's great, as you see off to the far right, is that the project ended in 2019 and 2023, that mechanism is still going. Next slide, please. So as said, after phase 1 did not work, CFFP developed a refined 4-step strategy. 1, show how investments can help grow the regional food economy. 2, commission research that informs that strategy. 3, identify or develop a financing vehicle that uses that research and supports the strategy. And then 4, evaluate the financial and non-financial returns of investments using an appropriate methodology. For step 1, CFFP realized they had to develop a different strategy for working in systems, one that incorporated different stakeholder interests, needs, and internal strategies. Since we wanted something that matched the developmental methodology that we were using, one that incorporates a key system engagement attribute of emergence, or as business calls it, agile development or learn as you go, CFFP felt it proper to call this a theory of action. The key aspect to recognize is that each pillar of work, which here graphically are the rows in the slides, that each pillar has its own starting point, action steps, benchmarks, momentum, and actors. There's less initial concern that one pillar is moving faster than another pillar. However, the pillars should sync up in time as they advance from exploring and emerging into sustaining and system change in order to fully achieve the proof points. This model requires a large variety of different players to advance all the work. CFFP focused on advancing Pillar 4 for this specific project with the knowledge that other actors including grantees, are already working on other pillars. A few partners still refer to this overarching strategy for their individual work and across pillars. Next slide, please. The second step, commission research of economic drivers and investment opportunities, conveniently coincided with the end of the Oregon Infrastructure Gap Analysis, a 15-month study funded by Meyer Memorial Trust, a CFFP partner. They'd hired a group called EcoTrust to do that work. That report provided solid evidence that mid-scale producers need key infrastructure to compete. As one frustrated farmer told researchers, "I just want to know why my product is more expensive when it hits the loading dock." From this inquiry, a quick case study pinpointed the cost of feed to small to mid-sized chicken producers as the primary driver of production costs. CFFP's market research sought to complement these findings by shifting the focus from infrastructure to production costs, including both Washington and Oregon. EcoTrust recommended focusing on the same 6 product categories: wheat and small grains, storage crops like potatoes and onions, organic greens, grass-fed beef, coop house pork, and pasture-raised chicken. As EcoTrust market research into the 6 products unfolded, it became clear the research was not resonating with many investors, especially the individuals. EcoTrust was then asked to create an opportunity analysis, high, mid, low, through its nonprofit lens that would rank the 6 product categories based on the opportunity to achieve positive and aligned growth. As a nonprofit, EcoTrust focused on viable opportunities to transform the food and agriculture system. For example, no-till grains can improve soil health while sequestering carbon and can be used for chicken feed. A for-profit analysis was also commissioned and was performed by Mark Bowman, a seasoned agriculture loan officer with Farm Credit Services, which emphasized for-profit investor priorities, production cost accuracy, potential linkages and gaps for investors, business configuration, and enterprise success and expertise. The 2 entities presented their findings in a very tense meeting. CFFP partners discussed the divergent recommendations, as you can see up top. Try to find a pattern on that graph on the left. Luckily, the wheat and small grains is on both as a high opportunity, and there actually is a grain revolution going on in the US. But what we realized was that foundations tend to fund for transformational system change, while for-profit investors seek to pick winners based on independent financial success. In other words, nonprofit investors seek to transform the overall system, while for-profit investors look for enterprises with the best chance of repaying their investments. One of the funders described it as a difference between a utopian, I want to change the world view, to what's actually going to provide some returns. Combining the 2 is pretty innovative, and it's very relative anywhere to make sure that you have different entities that you really need to engage, reading the research that you're underlying your work on. The logic model gap between nonprofit and for-profit investors needs to be acknowledged and overcome. CFFP and members agreed that any project seeking to bring funders together for maximum benefit can do something like this, and not just in food systems, but in any geographic footprint. I recall sharing this finding with one of the partner funders. Before I was done, he began to laugh. I said, "Why are you laughing?" He said, "Well, you just described our program team on the left and our investment team on the right." Next slide, please. The logic model gap highlighted in CFFP's research mirrored gaps highlighted in another impact investing report that came out about the same time. This graphic, modified from a 2016 report from the Tonic Institute and funded by the Shell Foundation, labels the opportunity gap as venture philanthropy. CFFP expanded it to include other terms, integrated capital, strategic loss, being used for this same space. Most every grant, if you think about it, is a minus 100% financial return, and any financial investment is above 0. It seeks capital preservation. There's a little gap between minus 100 and 0. I'll never forget when one funder said, "Okay, so how do we move to minus 50%? Next slide, please. So the emergence of the logic model gap kicked off the 3rd step, identify and develop a financing vehicle. In phase 1, what we had done was we had pulled grant capital to fund the project coordinator and contractors, and everybody invested on their own. We hired and contracted with a fiscal sponsor, Philanthropy Northwest. But in phase 2, we made a 180-degree pivot from phase one. We decided to pull grant capital to develop a food ag loan team at a regional lender and use their internal and leveraged assets to test true demand. We realized that a few partners were already working with Craft 3, a regional CDFI with 8 offices across the 2 states. CDFIs are community development finance institutions, as was mentioned. It's a structure regulated by the US Treasury Department to basically invest in community development, take higher risk than banks, which means usually come in earlier in the growth of the business, and invest in earlier stage and community-based businesses. Next slide, please. We met with Craft 3 on a quarterly basis, with this table being the final investment report after the 2-year trial period. The goal of the project was to deploy $10 million. Craft 3 successfully deployed $12.7 million to values-aligned businesses in the region. Craft 3 found that the individual loan amounts were typically smaller than those in the rest of their small business lending portfolio, but they were able to place more than anticipated capital. Compared with other loans to other sectors, Craft 3's food and ag loans involved more women-owned businesses and entrepreneurs of color than average. Quick example of a couple of investments. Adaptive Symbiotic Technologies, a company in Seattle, Washington. It was an early stage ag tech company focused on symbiotic fungal applications for seeds to increase drought and heat resiliency in agricultural crops. They needed purchase order financing and short-term working capital. Aspen Valley Ranch in Prineville, Oregon, in the eastern part of the state. They needed a bridge loan to purchase 1,000 acres. That loan was repaid through the sale of conservation easements. Umani Kushi, based in Portland, Oregon, is a minority-owned Japanese bakery and sauce manufacturer. They needed working capital and expansion financing, and I know that they are now in Seattle. So next slide, please. I was asked about scalability drivers. Well, scaling impact can be dependent on multiple factors: national, regional, global, same mechanism, same sector, food and ag, same regulatory structures. Any CDFI in the US could do this if they had flexible capital. What we recognized for this project was that strong social capital of trust and relationships, combined with an intermediary willing to be innovative, with their leadership buy-in being very critical. Project partners willing to engage with unassigned risk and willingness to de-risk innovation by testing concepts out, combined with a willingness to pivot as we go, and flexible capital to address the needs to achieve the overarching goals. Together, we realized we had a 34x blended return on investment, and that's a comparison of the $375,000 of grant capital that we raised to support the lending team for 2 years against the $12.7 million that was finally lent out. Next slide. For time's sake, we'll just skip over this one quickly. This is just really about risk management, about build relationships and trust, be comfortable and uncomfortable, design for complexity, learn as you go. If you design all the elements into the project, you're actually solving somewhat for complexity. And also make sure that you clarify language across silos. Just think of the word equity. To a program team, it means one thing. To the investment team, it means something drastically different. Key lessons here. Well, I'll just summarize it. You can look at this, but the main thing here is that risk is relative. When you bring in different definitions of risk, minus 100% financial loss on your grant, that's not the purpose of a grant. The grant is to address system change efforts, and so that we don't want it bad. But 100% financial risk to an investor, you recommend that your meeting will last less than a minute. And then how to de-risk innovation. This is all adds up to ability to hopefully do this again. And I'm working on a project trying to do that right now. Next slide, please. So you can download a case study here. I believe you can see this whole slide deck later. And I think that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Just a fascinating example. I wanted to encourage people who are listening, if you have specific questions about this initiative, to send it to Tim directly with a group chat in the chat function, and he can try to answer some of those while we're moving now to our second presentation in a very different part of the world, in a very different place, in a different point in its development. I'd like to introduce Sara Nanavati, who's the founder of Ethos Agriculture, who's representing the Ane Coffee Cooperative and their plan to generate finance for forest-friendly coffee landscapes. Please go ahead, Soren.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedules to participate in this program. Before I start, I also want to just give a moment of gratitude to the 1,000 Landscapes for not only inviting us to present, but also curating the people on this call. And throughout the process, I've been engaged with 1,000 Landscapes now for over a year, really providing some excellent technical support and even feedback for things as just like the presentation that you're about to participate in. Just a quick little note about myself. My background is in supply chains, specifically in coffee, cocoa, and cotton. I've worked in tropical agriculture for almost 20 years, and I've had a little bit of a, I guess you could say, a career path in the different levels of what it takes to manage a sustainable supply chain. I've worked in supply chain finance. I used to manage a cooperative of 5,000 members, design different sustainability programs for large corporates, helped in developing research programs around coffee and sustainability. And lastly, I've now supported cooperatives in developing their own sustainability approach. So this program that we're about to go through is really a culmination of a lot of those skills and then relationships that have been built across the coffee sector over time, which is now being presented through what we're calling forest-friendly coffee landscapes. Next slide, please. So just a quick little background on what's happening in the coffee sector. Production is not enough for coffee farmers to have a living income or to pay a living wage to coffee workers. The coffee production is estimated to almost double by 2050, which is going to encroach on up to 20 million hectares of forested land. This is because of climate change. The land that is going to be cultivated for additional coffee production is actually higher altitude, which is currently land that is not being used for production. Next slide, please. So there is a lot of attention right now within the coffee sector being paid on the ramifications of increasing production on the landscapes that we're sourcing coffee from. And over time, more and more supply chains have been using a strategy of coffee insetting rather than coffee offsetting. And coffee insetting is basically looking at and measuring the coffee that is within your supply chain, and then developing strategies to either reduce emissions or reduce the amount of carbon that is being emitted or the possibility of being sequestered. We are going to focus specifically on the insetting of carbon through the actual production side of the coffee supply chain. Next slide, please. And so coffee insetting provides an opportunity for supply chain partners to unite forces around common sustainability themes. And cooperatives actually could play a very valuable role in managing landscapes through a coffee insetting strategy. When thinking about cooperatives, just for everybody's, just a quick definition, aggregate large numbers of farmers so they can collectively sell and process different types of tropical commodities. We work specifically in coffee and cocoa for this specific supply chain. Next slide, please. So Ane is the largest organic coffee exporter, fair trade organic coffee exporter in Colombia. They were actually the first organic, the first cooperative to be certified organic in Colombia 27 years ago. And now they are kind of rethinking their strategy as a cooperative and trying to transition from just being a supplier of commercial agriculture to a landscape manager and all of the activities it would take to become a landscape manager. So they are leveraging their membership of 500 farmers, 500 families, partnerships, technology to create a new approach for carbon insetting. And the goal is to generate more local employment associated with their landscape, to increase member income, and to improve the ecological health via agroforestry, reforestation, and conservation practices. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the statistics in ANE. ANE is quite a sophisticated cooperative. It has 30 employees, 12 field staff. It represents 4 indigenous groups, and it's based in the northeast of Colombia. It happens to just a quick quick few facts about the kind of volumes they're doing. They did about 1.5 million pounds of coffee last year. They manage around $5 million of credit to essentially have the working capital and the trade credit to move that type of volume. And they've also started now diversifying into cocoa production. Next slide, please. They're located in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is referred to as El Corazón del Mundo, which is the heart of the world. It happens to be the highest coastal mountain range, basically goes from sea level to 19,000 feet, has 36 rivers that are providing fresh water to 1.5 million people in the surrounding communities. As I mentioned, it is home to 4 indigenous communities, the Arhuaca, also known as the Ica, the Wiwa, the Kogi, and the Conquama. And it is considered one of the most irreplaceable areas of conservation of, it's actually a globally recognized biodiversity hotspot. It's a UN World Heritage Site, and it's also a UN Center for Humanity. Next slide, please. Even though the Sierra has protected status within Colombia, there's still quite a few threats that are not only affecting the traditions of the 4 communities that live within the area, but also affecting the landscape itself. So there's high rates of deforestation and climate change. These are the 2 big factors that are really causing organizations like ANE to rethink how they can use coffee and cocoa as a way to protect their sacred lands. Next slide, please. So we have developed our relationship with ANE over the last 4 years. We actually share partnerships with some of their buyers. And through this relationship, we have developed a model. This model is very much a long-term approach. So our commitment to ANE with Ethos Agriculture, we're a design firm. And our commitment is not to just think of this as a project, but as a partnership that we will continue to engage in over hopefully a 20+ year arrangement. And we are looking for subsidized loans and to finance infrastructure and working capital. These loans would be repaid based on cash flow from coffee, cocoa, and carbon sales. We are also looking for grants to support the upfront costs of setting up a carbon management program. And lastly, when developing a carbon management program, there is a bit of a gestation period of around 2 years. So we finance that gap through the sales of through proceeds that come from that come from coffee and cocoa. I'm sorry, there's so many C's in this presentation. I'm getting a little tangled up. Next slide, please. So this is very much a shared leadership program. Currently, we have a group of organizations that are all taking lead roles in how this supply chain is transitioning into a carbon-friendly supply chain in which it's transparently managed and monitored. With ANE setting up all of the field operations on how to not only plant trees associated with the reforestation aspect of this work, but then also use their technical team to support the 500 members within their cooperative to have integrated farm level plans, and then those plans be able to be monitored for the amount of carbon being sequestered. We work with the Acorn platform, which is part of Rabobank, to use their satellite and artificial intelligence technology for measuring and monitoring the carbon associated with this project. We're working with Fair Trade International and specifically their climate change program to develop this as a model for sharing with other cooperatives that are interested in transitioning into carbon sales or the carbon market. And lastly, as Ethos, we support the program design and support also market access. That means helping ANE talk about this program to coffee buyers that are interested in insetting their carbon within their supply chain, and also organizations like Thousand Landscapes, donors, and financial institutions that are interested in also supporting this type of approach. Next slide, please. So just quickly, we've looked at a small model. So when thinking of a lot of integrated landscape programs, many times the scope of the program is quite large. And in this particular case, we're looking at a cooperative as a way to manage a landscape based on the membership that they already have, and really target the jurisdiction of what we can essentially monitor over time. And so in this project, we're first looking at 2,000 hectares, roughly around 5,000 acres. It's a combination of agroforestry and reforestation. And agroforestry is actually, there's plenty of research to back up how agroforestry kind of supports biodiversity health by providing some continuity in between farms and areas to allow for biological corridors. Our carbon goals are based on basically planting 3.7 million trees and being able to transparently measure roughly 9,000 tons of carbon captured per year. If that is successful, we will be able to generate at $20 a ton of carbon, roughly around $180,000 of additional income. And this additional income is really important because we're really leveraging a lot of data that ANE already has in place, because this data is being collected through their organic certification and the field team. So it's not really about doing something separate, but really complementing the opportunity that ANE has, and being able to use data not just for complying for certification, but to use data to demonstrate that it's an opportunity to increase another income stream for their members. Next slide, please. So there's a few risk management points that I'll mention. Agroforestry is a win-win situation. It allows for stabilizing production. It can allow for increasing incomes through carbon, and it obviously demonstrates a responsible way for managing a coffee landscape, not just looking at a particular farm, but really looking at a production region as a whole. The carbon projects associated with insetting have a lot of interest in the coffee sector. I'm actually in Oregon right now. I'm just finishing a 4-day coffee conference, which is the largest trade show in the world. And carbon is essentially the main theme that is being talked about to comply with the new EU regulations and to demonstrate a commitment towards a more forest-friendly coffee sector. And lastly, in setting programs, especially the ones that are being now implemented by Acorn, have quite a bit of data and images associated with how a landscape is actually transitioning into becoming more carbon neutral or carbon negative. And some of those points are listed below. Next slide, please. Scalability around these programs have two opportunities. The first is depth. Setting up a carbon management program is time consuming and it can be, I would say, expensive. However, once it's set up, it's obviously easier to enroll more farmers and their respective land into the program itself. And the second thing is breadth. ANE is really acting as this as a model right now for the coffee and cocoa sector. If we can demonstrate how cooperatives can be effective landscape managers, inset carbon, utilize agroforestry and reforestation to generate income beyond what they're getting for their commercial activities, this is a model that can quickly be replicated for other cooperatives that have the systems in place to be able to also manage their own carbon plans. Next slide, please. So some of the key lessons from our past few years of working with ANE is that collaborating with organic cooperatives that are clear about their values is really important. Organic also has a lot of research on demonstrating itself as the best agriculture practice that sequesters carbon, and also many organic cooperatives are already practicing agroforestry in terms of the way that their membership is growing not only coffee, but also food crops, timber, and many times medicinal crops. The second point just to remember is exploring landscape and landscape management and carbon models. It's important to look at all different types of models when trying to figure out what's the right fit. This has been extremely it's been extremely useful to obviously be participating in the 1,000 landscapes to do this next point, because by participating in this platform, we're able to see how different what are different approaches to landscape management, and it gives us a little bit of a foresight on how we need to design our approach specific to the context of cooperatives and the landscapes that they're operating in. The carbon programs are typically 20 years, so it requires a long-term commitment. These are not projects, they're really programs. And when developing these types of programs, we look for a commitment of buyers so that they continually purchase from the same locations, and we can actually see change over time. When designing insetting programs, we want those insetting programs to be opportunities for long-term investment in communities, but also opportunities in which the coffee that's being sequestered out of that, the carbon that's being sequestered out of the coffee that's being sourced is a way in which we can demonstrate a kind of a positive feedback loop as we continue to increase production to meet consumer demand. When thinking also about developing carbon management plans and really landscape strategies for cooperatives, we want to build on systems that are already in place. And it's like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, many cooperatives have data systems, they have technology, they have extension teams, and they have infrastructure like nurseries and even composting plants. And when you're developing carbon management plans, that infrastructure really is important to make sure that the cooperatives have the capacity to kind of take on this additional work complement their commercial activities while at the same time not cannibalize the existing operations that they currently have in place. And lastly,
If you could just wrap up now, that would be great. We'll move on to
sure,
the
this is my last
comments that
point.
people might
Yeah,
have. Sure.
no worries. So the last point is it's the model is around 2,000 hectares for ANE, but starting at 1,000 hectares, if you're looking at a smaller model, is probably the minimum, just based on the upfront cost required to set up this type of program. I think that is it on my end, and I'm sorry if I went over a little bit,
Oh,
Sarah.
problem. It's just fascinating. Thank you so much, Soren. And let me encourage folks who have any specific questions to go ahead and ask them in the chat, and Soren can try to do his best to answer it or provide some other resources. So now we're going to move into the moderated discussion, where the rest of you that are in the group also get a chance to contribute to this whole dialogue. The first part of the moderation period's going to be done by Jean-Louis Robadi, who's the co-founder of the Regenerative Development Group and co-leads the 1,000 Landscapes Finance Accelerator workstream with Seth. The second part will be moderated by Latul Baria, the senior program manager at the Loudest Foundation, where he leads their global program on regenerative agriculture production landscapes. But before they get into their discussion, we're going to ask for a technical intervention from my colleague Shannon Sunderland, who's going to explain how to use the Zoom whiteboard so that we can capture the inputs from all the rest of you into this dialogue. So over to you, Shannon.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. So as we move into the portion of this moderated discussion, I want to kind of just share a little bit about the technology that we're going to use to facilitate the discussion. So in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and it will show a new feature from Zoom called a whiteboard. Some of you might have used it before or used something similar, such as Miro or Mural online. But this whiteboard is fully integrated into Zoom, so you won't have to click on any link to access it. Once I share my screen, you'll actually be able to interact with the board using your cursor, and you'll be able to see actually your cursor and others as they move across the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and share that with everyone right now. Let's just give it a second. Great. So here you can see this is our Zoom whiteboard. And you'll notice that you can see your cursor and others as it's moving across the board. I'm going to just adjust it so that you guys will be able to see the indications here for the directions of how we're going to use the board. So for this session, now that I've shared my screen, you can zoom in and out on your own particular screen, but I will also zoom in and out so folks are able to most clearly access it. You can see that we have our first discussion question just right here, and I'll actually move it so that it's able to be seen within the screen here. So this is the first question, and what we're going to go ahead and do is that you also see that we have these colored sticky notes, and each of these different colors corresponds to a broad category of participants here today, and you'll be able to see that here. So for yellow, we have grant makers. For orange, we have investors. Blue are landscape service providers, so providers of technical or programmatic support to landscapes. Landscape stakeholders are green, which are participants who are embedded in landscapes or who source from landscapes in collaboration with other local actors. And then if you find that you don't actually find yourself falling into any of those categories, you can use the red sticky notes, and that just categorizes others. So basically what you'll do is once Jean-Louis is done with sort of the first prompt, we'll give you about 2 minutes to enter your thoughts. And the way that you can do that is by simply selecting one of the sticky notes on the screen and beginning to type. So you'll see here that I have selected a yellow, and I am writing here as an example. Now, you'll be able to either expand or minimize your sticky note as you go along. You can also zoom in and zoom out on the board at will so that you can, sort of help navigate. If you have any questions during the actual discussion session, feel free to message myself or to message Lily with any questions. If you don't feel comfortable adding notes to the board, that's okay. Feel free just to observe what others are writing or share in the chat. And also, if you would be so kind as to add the name of your organization in each of your responses, that would be a great help. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jean-Louis. And of course, I'm available in the chat if you have any questions or need any assistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon. Jean-Louis, over to you.
Yes. Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Sarah, and everybody. First of all, let me acknowledge everybody on this call. Thank you for being here, including many friends. We now have right now about 70 people on the call, which is wonderful. I think a little earlier we had about 100 people. And acknowledge 1,000 Landscapes. I think when we say radical collaboration, there's a core group of people, and I'm fortunate to be a part of that collaborates very closely within 1,000 Landscapes. But I think it's all of us. And just to tee up this next conversation, this dialogue really is an invitation from 1,000 Landscapes for all of us to be part of this journey. An hour and a half feels like a very short period of time to really go deep. And just hearing Tim and Soren is both so inspiring, and we feel that we're just skating the surface, and we are just going to skate the surface over the next few minutes. So for this part, and I hope everybody was able to access the whiteboard and is able to find a sticky note and insert your questions. So the question that we'd like to really tease out and really welcome your thoughts, your observations, based on what you heard in the presentations and based on your own experience, what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities for finance institutions to develop landscape finance mechanisms? It's a pretty dense question. But the topic is complex, and I think simply hearing Tim and Soren and imagining the layers of work that they've had to do in order to get to where they are, I think we can all see that there's an immense opportunity, and it is inspiring to see these mechanisms as well as the others that prepared presentations for this dialogue. And it's hard, right? Let's face it, it's a multi-year process, it's a multi-stakeholder process. So would love to hear your thoughts on what you see as some of the opportunities and challenges, either based on the work that you're doing or based on what you heard from these two presentations. So we'll give this a few minutes. We're running a little bit behind. So we'll give this a couple of minutes and then open it up for some quick remarks from some of you. And I'll invite Candice Stevens in a minute, who is working out of Southern Africa and has been very active in sustainable finance generally and landscape finance specifically, to share some of her observations. But first, let's see what we all come up with. And I'll be tracking what you all write and surfacing some of the ideas that seem to be coming up.
Just so everyone's aware, I'm going to adjust the page a little bit because I think folks are having some trouble accessing the sticky notes. So for those of you who may be having trouble, just stay tuned and I'll do my best to help you guys out.
And if it's easier, you can, of course, write in the chat as well, in the chat function. So I'm just going to highlight just a few themes that are coming up, different definitions of risk. And I think Tim did a nice job and a very, very vivid job illustrating this very question. How to move from short-term to long-term project development and thinking. How to move from a project approach to what's Soren called the programmatic approach, or what we like to call an integrated landscape approach. Someone highlighted the challenge, how to engage stakeholders who are maybe currently invisible in the landscape, but who are users of landscape services, and how to ensure that there is a truly inclusive approach to landscape finance. Someone else is mentioning silos and how these silos are preventing cross-sectoral approaches. So this is great. So as you finish, and I think Shannon, you're planning to take down the board in just a minute. And by the way, this information, of course, is being recorded and will be available. Will be shared. Will be integrated in a mirror board actually that we started creating during the first dialogue. So nothing here will get lost.
So we'll give everyone just about 30 more seconds, and then we will pass it on to the tool. Oh, sorry. No, then we'll actually get into the discussion. Excuse me.
Yeah. Thank you, Shannon. And I recognize we're running a little bit late, so we might need to shorten the dialogue a little bit, but we'll invite Candice first. Welcome, Candice. If you would be willing to maybe share a few thoughts from your experience, from your work in Southern Africa and beyond on this question of what are the challenges and what are the opportunities with landscape finance?
Jean-Louis, thank you so much for the invitation. It's fantastic to be on this webinar with so many participants linked to 1,000 landscapes. I think the question that you've raised is absolutely critical, and the fundamental issue that we face is how do we translate flows of finance, regardless of what source they come from or what instrument they're using to the real point of impact? How do we translate them into places, landscapes with real people, with real needs and real interventions on the ground? And this remains an ongoing issue that the Sustainable Finance Coalition, as well as partners together with 1,000 landscapes, are beginning to unpack and be able to increase those flows of finance. So I think when it comes to financial institutions, there's a couple of key points that I want to be able to highlight that enables those institutions to bridge the gap and start to see flows of finance to the real point of impact. So one of those is the question of risk and return. So risk is obviously something that is different depending on where in the financial sector we're looking. But importantly, we have to be able to push the envelope a little bit. There has to be a bit of a meet and match and a bit of a pioneering and innovation space to bridge the gap around risk. So regardless of whether we're looking at private banks or impact investors or grant makers, there are risk parameters that each of those are going to have. And so I constantly advocate in the sectors that we engage in the coalition to really think about how do we push the parameters of understanding risk so that we can begin to bridge the gap. Then the second thing is looking at return. Obviously, we want to be able to see a financial return, but really critically important is that environmental and social returns need to be valued as highly, if not more so, when we're looking at financial return. And I don't think it's an either-or conversation. It's something that we can really begin to address if we're able to target finance at a landscape level. And then the third thing is that I really do believe there is a horizon of opportunity for us on the landscape finance front that enables us to target finance with real impacts for people and places on the ground, and to be able to have all of those returns happening simultaneously across the spectrum of environmental, social, and economic considerations. So really, I think when we want to address constraints, we have to be able to look at how innovative can we be, and how do we start to push the envelope in our understanding of translating finance into landscapes.
Thank you so much, Candice. Thank you. And I know you have a lot of experience and a lot of practical examples from Southern Africa primarily, and one of your colleagues and one of our close partners, Roland Forwerk, who I think left this call, likes to say, what is the impact at the household level? And I use this phrase a lot because it just, I think, should make us all feel very grounded that at the end of the day, and to your point, it should really have an impact, and a positive impact at that household level and on the ecology and the land that surrounds these households. So we have a lot of sticky notes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Maybe I'll invite, if one or two of you want to just to say a few words.
Maybe one.
Yeah, maybe one, one person. And so please speak up if anyone feels like you want to add something. Viva voce, please do. And then if not, we'll move to the second question, and I'll turn to Litul to facilitate this conversation.
Shannon, I think you can move the whiteboard there.
Great. I'll move to the second page then.
But just wait,
Yeah,
until we have.
It'll just take a moment.
Yeah, that's okay.
All right, so we're here in the second whiteboard.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks, John Louis. It was really insightful to hear the challenges and opportunities for financial institutions to develop place-based funding mechanism. Now, in this part of the session, we'll shift to understand the challenges and opportunities for local actors. And the question we have is, based on what you heard in the presentations and your own experiences, what are the challenges and opportunities for local actors to contribute to design and development of place-based multi-sectoral finance mechanism? We'll follow the same process. Please add your comments to the board, and depending on the category of stakeholder you represent, and we have about 2 minutes, and then we move into the discussions. Hello.
Yes, so we have the timer counting down. If anyone has any questions, Lily has also put the discussion question in the chat, and you're welcome to share your responses in the chat as well if you're unable to access the sticky notes.
Shannon, are we on page 2 of the whiteboard?
We are on page 2. We should be able to see page 2. And I just want to make sure that folks are able to see that question as well.
One challenge which is really coming out is coordination among multiple stakeholders, staff.
If you're still seeing, for folks who might still be seeing page 1, you can click on there's the lower right-hand corner of the different pages, and you can click on page 2. The page 2 is currently being displayed, but it looks like perhaps there is some challenges to access it. So if you just go to the lower right-hand corner where there's the navigation bar at the bottom, and you just click and head to page 2, you should be able to see that board. I'll give everyone another minute or so to answer their questions and get everyone situated, because I know this is some new technology that we're navigating here. But we appreciate your enthusiasm and participation.
Okay, so I think we are about time.
Yes.
So yeah, so to kickstart the discussion on this, I would like to first invite Stephanie Lang, the Executive Director from the Legacy Landscape Fund, to share her thoughts.
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me, but it seems yes. And I don't know if you can see me, but that's not so important. Yeah, here you are. Thank you, Litul. Thank you, the organizers, to give me a little bit of space to talk here. I think this is an extremely important discussion, and it's a pity that we can't do this in person and with a little bit more time. The Legacy Landscapes Fund is a granting institution. So we are giving grants to large landscapes over 2,000 square kilometers large. And those landscapes are mostly anchored around a protected area. So we call this a triple dividend grant, because the triple dividend is biodiversity, climate, but also people. And we are calling this not a biodiversity fund or a protected area fund, but we're calling it a Legacy Landscapes Fund for a purpose, and for a reason, because it is very much a landscape approach, taking into account that even 1 million is not enough to fund coordination, to fund landscapes work, to also represent all the different stakeholders and actors in such large landscapes adequately. But 1 million can help those actors to take the time to coordinate and to take the time to plan and to develop a programmatic approach, because our funding is given for 15 years or even in perpetuity. And we just heard it before, landscapes work cannot work in a project, stop and go approach. It cannot work in predefined activities. It needs to be flexible. And this is exactly what Legacy Landscape Fund tries to do. So when it comes to the challenges for local actors, I think we have heard a very interesting term earlier, the invisible actors. I like that very much, because in in a landscape around a protected area, everybody tends to look at the same people all the time. And this is, of course, the biodiversity institutions, the protected area institutions, then some villages around or inside the protected areas. And then potentially all those what we perceive often in the biodiversity community as threatening actors, the mining industry, the agricultural investors, the road infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And this is what we try to break, those silos. What we try to see is that protected areas are given certain ecosystem services for everybody around. We have to make, first of all, everybody aware that ecosystem services are provided by protected areas, and they are basically de-risking in a non-financial sense, but in a more natural resource sense, they are de-risking all the investments that are made in road infrastructure, other infrastructure, in water provision, in health, and in fresh air, and in communities, and of course also in agriculture. So what we are trying to encourage is that the implementing partners of the Landscapes Fund, those who are getting the $1 million each year to implement certain activities, are working very much in a steering group approach, not necessarily creating a new steering group if there is already one, but encouraging everybody to come on board, doing capacity building with certain actors, doing communication, including all those different actors around a landscape to talk together and to see, okay, we have an ecosystem of interests, we have an ecosystem of different actors, we have an ecosystem of capacities, and we have an ecosystem of different funding models, investments, grants, loans, all of that. Let's try to bring it together, and let's use everything in synergy and not competing with each other. And let's also use the funding of the Legacy Landscapes Fund to pay for those gaps that are normally always emerging, the coordination costs, the operation costs, all of those, let's say, more unexciting costs that come up when you manage landscapes, when you manage protected areas. So we can work across the pyramid. So the more targeted funding is served first, and then always in the end comes the Legacy Landscapes funding contribution to fill in the gaps. And those gaps can be looking at a stakeholder capacity building. It can go into agriculture extension service. It can go into business planning for a wider landscape. So I think we cannot look at actors alone. We always need to see actors in what kind of access they have, what kind of capacity they have, in a power matrix, where do they stand, and then try to be as inclusive as possible from the beginning with all the human rights standards, but also with the understanding of businesses and so on and so forth, and use the flexible funding that we now can grant as an institution, as one of the one funding institutions, to make sure that we develop systems and processes that include those actors from the beginning, but also build up their capacity to be in the governance and in the steering and in the decision-making bodies of those landscape approaches. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie, for sharing your thoughts. And for those of you who are interested in knowing more, it's also, the project is available on the Miro board, and you can refer to that. Now, I'd like to invite Mr. Aziz Ahmed from Landscape Resilient Fund to share his thoughts. And I may request you to also keep it brief because we're almost about time.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much for this opportunity to contribute to the discussions. Yeah, I mean, I'm Aziz Ahmed, Ghana Landscape Coordinator for the Landscape Resilience Fund. Indeed, with regards to the question, landscape actors have an important role to play in terms of designing, and not just designing, but also in the implementation of landscape finance mechanisms. What we do see is that local actors need to be consulted and engaged, actively engaged, and their inputs consistently sought after, such that landscape finance mechanisms reflect their needs, their aspirations, and their long-term visions. And this is what we do at the Landscape Resilience Fund. if you take, for example, our first investment into a company called Coa Impact Ghana, Coa Impact is a high impact SME that works with smallholder farmers in cocoa landscapes in Ghana to basically turn what would otherwise be waste into a useful product for farmers and then give them additional income for that. So this action of this company that the Landscape Resilience Fund supports ties into the long-term vision of the landscape. First, to improve livelihoods. I heard a few comments around improving the livelihood of farmers and small, which is very important, because if the people don't have, that safety net, then issues of environmental protection, biodiversity conservation becomes a challenge. And so in addition to what COA does, or in addition to our support to COA, we also intervene at the landscape level. And I think the earlier speaker right now spoke a lot about what is important for the landscape level. We also do similar activities in the landscapes where we operate. So for example, we support local stakeholders to strengthen landscape governance and landscape multi-stakeholder platforms. As has been said already, where such platforms exist, we come in to strengthen what is being done and not to reinvent the wheel or create new structures. Also, we support landscape level sustainability indicator monitoring and reporting using acceptable standards like the land scale to help generate useful data and information at a landscape level to inform future investments that, for example, the Landscape Resilience Fund will make, or other investments that will come into the landscape. What we see in conclusion is that there is a need to build more landscape level partnerships based on each actor's strength and their capabilities. And this also has been mentioned in, I think, the earlier presentation, or even in the first presentation. And then there is a need for more grant capital to come in to develop more bankable projects such that these projects will be ready for impact investment or impact investors. Just to say, from our perspective as the Resilience Fund, we do have 25 million from Channel at the moment and 1.3 million from the Global Environment Facility. But when we see the scale of what needs to be done in terms of the landscape approach and the SME investments, this is huge. And we are expecting to actually reach 100 million by 2026. And for this, we call on other philanthropies, donor agencies, development partners to come on board and then help us scale the impact that we are doing, for example, with COA, but we want to support many COAs that are working with smallholder farmers that have strong linkages in these rural landscapes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aziz. And over to you, Sarah.
Sorry, there's just too much to talk about. It's really exciting. Thank you for those who discussed it, for all of you who added things to the whiteboard as well. I want to remind everybody that you can access these other landscape finance mechanisms on the 1000 Landscape website, and they're just as fascinating as the two that you've heard today. There's also going to be another webinar series supported by the 1000 Landscapes Finance Group dedicated exclusively to landscape finance mechanisms later this year. So stay tuned for that. We will share the event recording, the edited chat, and the whiteboard, and a brief report on the event. We all have also prepared, as Daniel had mentioned, a master Miro online whiteboard to facilitate conversation, and the link is there in when you get the PowerPoint, you'll see it. It has an overview of the topics addressed also in the first dialogue, and we'll use it to discuss the third dialogue as well. And that third one is going to be happening on June the 8th, same time, 10 a.m. Eastern time. And we'll be letting you know a little bit more about that. You'll be able to review some of the resources available on the 1000 Landscapes website, including all the slide decks. I would like to close by thanking Annalise Withos of Akia Foundation, Latul, who you've already heard, and Deepika Nukala of the Loudest Foundation for their finance and communication support to 1000 Landscapes and to this dialogue series, and also to today's wonderful speakers, presenters, and to the dialogue organizers, Daniel Zimmer of Climate Kick, Seth Seamus, Juan Ramos, and myself of Eco Agriculture Partners, Alejandro Diaz of Common Land, Jean-Louis Robadi of Regenerative Development Group, and Sarah Luchbagger of Rainforest Alliance. We appreciate communication support. Thank you so much, Shannon, for your inputs today, and Isabella Klein and Mike Keller, also colleagues from EcoAg, and organizational support from Lily Hamilton from EcoAg. I hope you all have a wonderful day. I hope you've been inspired by what you've been hearing, and we look forward to learning more about all the work that all of you in this event have been doing. Take care.